The room was too quiet for a deal worth millions. The long table was made of dark wood, polished so well that the ceiling lights reflected like small white stars. Tall glass windows showed the city outside, busy and loud. But inside the boardroom, everything felt stiff and controlled. Every chair was filled. Men and women in expensive suits sat straight, their tablets open, papers neatly stacked. This meeting had been planned for weeks, maybe months. Everyone believed it would end the same way most high-level meetings did, with signatures, handshakes, and smiles. For the camera's dot at the far end of the table sat the CEO. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, as if nothing in the world could surprise him anymore. He had that kind of confidence that came from years of being listened to. When he spoke, people nodded. When he smiled, deals moved forward. Today was no different. He glanced around the room, already tasting success, already thinking about the press release that would go out by evening. A few seats away, slightly pushed back from the center of attention, sat a young black woman. Her chair did not match the others. It was a simple office chair brought in at the last minute. She did not complain. She never did. She was there as a junior consultant, invited only because someone from the legal team had fallen sick that morning. She knew she was replaceable. She knew most people in the room did not even remember her name. She sat quietly, hands folded, eyes moving between the contract pages and the people speaking. While others talked, she listened. While others assumed, she read. She had learned long ago that silence could be safer than words, especially in rooms where power lived. The room felt heavier now. The papers that had seemed perfectly fine just moments ago were being looked at with new eyes. The CEO leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples briefly, as if he were realizing something he had never noticed before. The other executives, some relaxed a few minutes earlier, now sat straighter, their focus sharper. Something had shifted, though it was subtle. The air, which had felt routine and professional, was now charged with unease and curiosity. The young black woman remained seated, calm on the surface, but her heart raced. She had expected some pushback, some dismissal, even some rolling of eyes. Yet, as she saw the slight frown, the CEO sat alone for a few minutes after the meeting broke. The city skyline stretched before him, tall buildings reflecting the late afternoon sun. The hum of traffic below was distant and unimportant. What mattered now was inside this room, inside this building, inside his own mind. He leaned back in his chair and thought quietly about the events that had just unfolded. The clause, the discussion, the young consultant's clear voice, it all kept replaying in his mind. He had been in similar situations before, or so he thought. Hundreds of contracts, countless deals, years of experience. He trusted the process, trusted his team, trusted himself. Yet, here was a single clause that could have been overlooked and caused serious problems in the future. And it had taken some the next morning. The boardroom felt different. The usual sounds of people shuffling papers and adjusting chairs were accompanied by an air of anticipation. The CEO had called everyone back with a clear purpose: to review the clause and ensure the contract reflected fairness, clarity, and responsibility. The young woman arrived early, as always, placing her notes carefully on the table and reviewing the points she had highlighted the day before. She knew this meeting would require precision, patience, and continued clarity. Executives took their seats, some still cautious, others curious. The CEO entered shortly after, moving with measured steps, acknowledging the team with a nod. His expression was calm but focused. The lessons from the previous day were evident in his demeanor. He had reflected on the implications of oversight, on the responsibility of leadership, and on the importance of listening to voices that might not always be loud, but were precise and thoughtful. The legal team began presenting their findings. systematically reviewing potential scenarios and implications of the clause in question. Charts, projections, and analysis were shared. The data confirmed what the young woman had observed. The clause, though technically correct, could shift significant responsibilities to one party, limit responses in changing circumstances, and create potential long-term challenges. Each example was grounded in practical situations that could affect operations, finances, and reputation. The CEO listened intently, occasionally nodding, occasionally pausing to consider the impact. His eyes often drifted toward the young woman, acknowledging silently the insight she had brought. The room was attentive, the previous tension replaced by a shared focus on understanding and problem-solving. What could have been a routine, uninspired review had transformed into a thorough evaluation that balanced risk with fairness. After the review, the CEO spoke. His voice was calm but carried weight. "We now understand the real implications of this clause," he said. "It is not enough for language to be technically correct. We must ensure that agreements are fair, practical, and sustainable for all parties involved." He paused, letting the words sink in. "This requires action." He turned toward the young woman. "Your observations yesterday were crucial in guiding us to see the full picture. Your careful attention and willingness to speak up have reminded us of the importance of detail, foresight, and ethical responsibility. Thank you." A subtle acknowledgement passed around the room. Heads nodded. Even those who had been skeptical before now recognized her value. The moment was quiet but significant. Recognition was given not for show, but because it was earned through insight, accuracy, and courage. The CEO continued, addressing the broader team. "We will revise the clause to ensure it reflects shared responsibility clearly and fairly. We will account for potential future scenarios and remove any language that might create unintended limitations or obligations. This is not just a legal adjustment. It is a commitment to fairness and responsibility." As the discussion turned to specifics, the young woman contributed where appropriate, clarifying points, suggesting language adjustments, and ensuring the explanations remained practical and understandable. She did not dominate the conversation, but offered guidance where needed. Her presence had shifted from an observer to a collaborator, a respected contributor whose input guided critical decisions. The legal team drafted adjustments in real time, incorporating suggestions and verifying that the new language addressed the issues raised. Each adjustment was considered carefully, with the CEO and senior executives weighing the practical impact and fairness of the changes. The atmosphere was cooperative, focused on achieving a balanced outcome rather than defending authority or status as the contract evolved. The CEO reflected internally. Leadership was not about always being right or about making decisions quickly. It was about ensuring that decisions were informed, fair, and responsible. The young woman's insight had sparked this reflection and had guided the team toward a better outcome. He recognized that listening, acknowledging contributions, and acting with integrity were as important as experience and authority. Hours passed as the adjustments were refined. The young woman remained composed, taking notes and reviewing language carefully. The team tested scenarios, considered consequences, and ensured clarity. The contract, once a source of potential risk, was now structured to balance responsibilities fairly and transparently. Finally, the CEO looked around the room. "We've made the necessary revisions. The clause now reflects our commitment to fairness and clarity, protecting all parties involved and allowing for reasonable adjustments in the future. I am confident that this version addresses the risks we identified and reflects our values as a company." There was a quiet murmur of agreement. The sense of accomplishment was palpable. A potential problem had been addressed thoughtfully, responsibly, and collaboratively. The young woman, who had initially raised concerns, allowed herself a brief smile. The work had not been easy, and the process required persistence and composure, but the outcome justified the effort. The CEO continued, addressing the room more broadly. This process is a reminder of the importance of careful review, attention to detail, and the courage to speak up when something does not seem right. Every voice matters, and every perspective adds value. Today, we have ensured that our actions reflect integrity, responsibility, and respect for all involved. The young woman's colleagues acknowledged her contributions quietly, through nods and subtle gestures. Respect had been earned through clarity, accuracy, and courage. She had not sought recognition, but her insights had shaped the decisions of the day. The CEO had reinforced this, demonstrating that leadership recognized value and contribution wherever it came from. As the meeting concluded, the revised contract was ready for review and final approval. Everyone gathered their materials, some discussing details quietly among themselves, others reflecting on the process and its lessons. The young woman collected her notes, ensuring that all documentation of her observations and the discussions was clear and complete. Before leaving, the CEO approached her once more. "Your contributions have been invaluable," he said. "Your perspective helped us prevent potential challenges and guided us toward a solution that is fair and responsible. Keep trusting your instincts and continue to speak up. Your voice matters." She nodded respectfully. The acknowledgement was meaningful, but she remained focused on her work, understanding that responsibility and action mattered more than praise. She had contributed to a meaningful outcome, and the process itself had reinforced the value of insight, courage, and ethical reasoning. Outside the boardroom, the city moved at its usual pace. People hurried, unaware of the small but significant decisions being made above. Inside, the team had resolved a complex issue, guided by clarity, responsibility, and thoughtful insight. The young woman had demonstrated that even those at the edge of a room, often overlooked, could shape outcomes profoundly through careful observation and courageous communication. The CEO returned to his office, reflecting on the day's events. He recognized that leadership was strengthened by listening, by acknowledging insight, and by acting with integrity. He thought about the lessons learned and how they would influence future decisions. The young woman's contributions had set a standard, reminding everyone that fairness and accountability were not optional. They were essential. As the day ended, there was a quiet sense of accomplishment and understanding. The contract was secure, the risks addressed, and the team had collaborated effectively. The young woman left the boardroom, confident that her efforts had made a meaningful impact. Her voice, once quiet in a room of authority, had guided decisions, reinforced integrity, and helped ensure fairness. It was a reminder that courage, insight, and clarity could shape outcomes, even in spaces dominated by power and experience. One few expected someone at the edge of the room to point it out. He thought about his own rise to power. He remembered the moments when he had signed agreements quickly, trusting the words on paper without questioning deeply. He had relied on standard procedures and the expertise of others, often focusing more on results than on long-term consequences. At the time, it had worked. He had climbed the ladder, achieved success, and earned recognition. But now he realized that success could sometimes blind him to details that mattered more than he had imagined. The young woman's words echoed clearly in his mind. Simple, direct, thoughtful. She had not challenged him aggressively. She had not questioned his authority. She had pointed out a potential problem, explained it carefully, and left no room for misunderstanding. She had done so with courage, with humility, and with precision. He rubbed his forehead and exhaled slowly. His smile from earlier in the day, so confident and assured, was gone. There was no room for performance now, no room for quick decisions. The reality of leadership demanded thoughtfulness, responsibility, and sometimes humility. He began flipping through the contract again, looking at the clause through fresh eyes. The legal team had provided analysis, yes, but it was her initial insight that had guided them to look more carefully. He realized that insight often came from those who had no reason to seek recognition, only reason to ensure truth was seen. Her perspective was practical, grounded, and ethical. It made him reflect on how often voices like hers were overlooked in high-stakes rooms. As he studied the clause, he imagined potential scenarios, situations that might arise, challenges that could emerge. He saw how the clause could unintentionally harm one side, limiting options and creating long-term liabilities. It was technically correct, but the practical consequences were significant. He leaned back and let his mind wander briefly, thinking about leadership and decision-making. He considered the many times he had relied on authority and hierarchy instead of questioning deeply. He realized that his experience, while valuable, was not infallible. Wisdom required listening, observing, and sometimes stepping aside to let insight guide the decision. Even when it came from unexpected sources, he glanced at the young woman, still seated at the table with notes and papers organized neatly in front of her. She was calm, poised, and focused. There was no sign of arrogance, no pretense, no demand for recognition. Only clear thought and careful reasoning. He felt a quiet respect, perhaps for the first time in such a moment, for someone who had challenged him without confrontation. She had reminded him that leadership was not just about authority, it was about responsibility, foresight, and fairness. He remembered conversations he had had with other executives, discussions about risk, control, and outcomes. Often, these had been abstract, focused on numbers or reputation. Rarely had anyone insisted on considering the practical, human implications. She had done that effortlessly, and it had changed the dynamic of the meeting entirely. He thought about how easy it would have been to dismiss her. Many people would have. She was new, junior, and relatively unknown in the organization. Yet, dismissing her insight could have led to serious problems. He realized that power was not just about controlling decisions. It was also about recognizing when to listen, when to trust, and when to act with care. The CEO stood and began pacing slowly. The sunlight from the window illuminated the room, highlighting the stacks of papers, the laptops, and the quiet energy that still lingered. He reflected on the ethical responsibilities of leadership, the impact of decisions on people, and the subtle ways contracts could affect lives in ways not immediately visible. He thought about the board, the shareholders, and the employees who might one day be affected by the choices made in this room. He recognized that this clause, while small in appearance, had the potential to shape outcomes for years. It was a reminder that the details mattered, that careful consideration could prevent harm, and that courage to speak up should never be ignored. He returned to his chair and picked up the pen he had set down earlier. He studied the page, the paragraph that had sparked all this reflection. It was simple language, clean and professional. Yet the simplicity had disguised complexity, and complexity had the power to create consequences. He realized that fairness required action. Technical correctness was not enough. Leadership required accountability, even when it meant slowing down processes or questioning assumptions. He had been reminded that day that true authority was not only about power, it was about integrity and responsibility. The young woman continued her work, quietly reviewing notes and analyzing details. She had not sought attention, but her presence had made a difference. He watched her for a moment, recognizing that insight often came from those who observed carefully, spoke thoughtfully, and acted with clarity. She had reminded him that respect was earned through honesty, diligence, and courage. He made a note to revisit other contracts, to ensure that similar clauses did not create unforeseen problems. He realized that his role was not just to approve agreements, but to safeguard fairness, protect stakeholders, and guide decisions responsibly. The lesson was clear. Even in spaces dominated by power and experience, the clarity and courage of a single voice could redirect the course of decisions. He reflected on the importance of listening, even when it was uncomfortable. He thought about his previous meetings, moments when he might have overlooked subtle insights, moments when decisions could have been improved with careful attention. The young woman's courage had sparked reflection, learning, and a recognition that vigilance and humility were essential in leadership. As he looked back at the contract, he felt a renewed sense of responsibility. The meeting had reminded him that oversight was not just procedural, it was ethical. That decisions could ripple outward in ways not immediately visible. That courage, insight, and honesty could guide better choices. He stood once more, pacing the room. The city outside continued its constant movement, indifferent to the small but significant realizations taking place above. He thought about the people who would be affected by the choices made here, about the employees, the partners, and the communities. He knew that his role carried weight and that fairness required deliberate attention. Guided by clear insight, the young woman looked up briefly as he returned to his desk, meeting his eyes with calm assurance. There was no need for words. The acknowledgement was silent but mutual. Her insight had changed the room, and he recognized it fully. He'd been reminded that authority was strengthened, not weakened, by listening and acting responsibly. He took a deep breath, letting the lesson settle. The clause would need to be adjusted. The contract would be revisited. Decisions would be made with care. And he, as a leader, would carry forward the reminder that true power comes not only from experience and position, but from the courage to acknowledge truth, wherever it may come from. As the late afternoon light softened into early evening, he felt a quiet resolve. The meeting would continue tomorrow, the clause would be corrected, and the team would move forward with clarity and fairness. And he knew that this moment, this insight, and this young consultant had reminded him of the essential qualities of leadership: honesty, courage, and the willingness to listen. WNS and whispered comments around the room. She knew her words had landed. They had been heard. The CEO, a man used to controlling the room, seemed momentarily caught off guard. He was used to agreement, to smiles, to nodding heads. This was different. This required thought. Can you walk us through why this clause could be problematic? The CEO asked finally. His voice was still measured, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. He had to ask. Even he knew he did not have all the answers right away. She nodded. Her hands rested calmly on the legal team, had gathered in a small cluster, papers spread across the table and laptops open. The young woman stayed seated, observing quietly as they examined the clause she had highlighted. The room had changed. The casual atmosphere from earlier meetings, the polite nods, and smiles were gone. It was replaced by a sense of seriousness, a realization that the decisions made in this room could have real consequences. The CEO, who had been leaning back moments ago, now stood by the window, arms crossed. He looked out at the city skyline, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about previous deals, the ones he had signed quickly, trusting that all the language had been checked. He thought about the years of experience that had given him confidence, and yet, here he was, confronted with the possibility that even the smallest detail could create large problems. One of the senior legal advisors tapped the page of the contract, frowning. If she's correct, this clause could restrict our ability to make changes later, he said, his voice low but deliberate. It's not something we can ignore. Another lawyer added, the language is technically accurate, but practically, it places an uneven burden on one party. If certain situations arise, It could expose us to liability we hadn't accounted for. The young woman felt her pulse quicken, but she did not show it. Her role in this room had shifted from observer to critical voice. She had predicted this reaction, but seeing it unfold was different. She had always known that insight without careful explanation could be dismissed. That was why she had been calm, precise, and clear when she first spoke. Now, her words were being validated. The CEO finally turned from the window and faced the team. "We need to think about the broader impact," he said. His tone was measured, but there was an edge of urgency. "If this clause creates problems in the future, it could damage our credibility, our finances, and our relationships. We cannot afford to move forward blindly." He glanced at the young woman. She returned his look, steady and confident. It was a silent acknowledgement of the truth in her analysis. The CEO's expression softened slightly, showing the first hint of respect. For the first time, he seemed to consider her not as a junior consultant, but as someone whose insight had real weight. A few executives whispered among themselves, evaluating the implications of what had just been said. Some were skeptical, unsure if the risk was significant, but others were beginning to see the logic. The conversation had shifted from a routine contract review to a critical examination of potential consequences. The senior legal advisor, who had been quiet for a while, finally spoke up. "We should model different scenarios," he suggested. "See how this clause could affect the parties involved under various conditions. That way, we can understand the full impact before proceeding." The CEO nodded. "Agreed. Let's run those scenarios and reconvene in the afternoon. I want all of us to be clear about the risks and the outcomes. This cannot be a superficial review." The young woman felt a small sense of relief. Her voice had started a process that was necessary, even if uncomfortable. She knew the real work had just begun. It was no longer about being noticed. It was about ensuring that everyone in the room made decisions with the full picture in mind. The meeting adjourned briefly, and people began to stand, stretch, and leave the room in small clusters. The young woman remained seated for a moment, reviewing her notes and thinking about the next steps. She was aware that some people were still skeptical. Her role would be to continue providing clear, logical reasoning as the analysis progressed. As the room cleared, the CEO lingered near the window. He watched the city below, considering the choices he had made in previous deals and the oversight he had taken for granted. He thought about the young woman, whose careful observation and willingness to speak up had forced him to re-examine assumptions he had held for years. He reflected on leadership, responsibility, and the difference between technical correctness and practical fairness. The clause in question was not illegal, and it was standard in many agreements, but that did not mean it was ethical or safe. The young woman had reminded him of something important, that real accountability comes from careful consideration and the courage to speak out, even when it is uncomfortable. She watched as he took a deep breath and made a note on his pad. There was a quiet determination in his eyes. The pause in the meeting was no longer just procedural. It had become a moment of reflection, a recognition that leadership required humility as well as authority. Meanwhile, the legal team began analyzing the clause in detail, creating models and projections to understand potential outcomes. They considered different scenarios, from minor operational changes to unexpected financial pressures. Each analysis revealed nuances that had not been obvious at first glance. The young woman contributed where appropriate, offering clarity and highlighting specific points of concern. Her observations were grounded in real-world implications, not abstract legal theory, which made them resonate with the team. The afternoon wore on. Discussions grew intense but productive. Questions were asked and answered, and hypotheses were tested. The initial tension in the room gradually transformed into collaborative problem-solving. Even the skeptics began to acknowledge the value of careful analysis and thorough evaluation. The young woman noticed subtle nods, moments of eye contact, and quiet acknowledgments that indicated respect was being earned, not demanded. During a brief break, the CEO called her aside. "I want to thank you," he said quietly. "You spoke up at the right time, and your perspective is helping us see the full picture. Keep doing what you are doing." She nodded, accepting the acknowledgement without words. The moment was significant, but she remained focused on the work ahead. Recognition was secondary. Understanding and action were primary. She knew that the decisions made in the next few hours could have far-reaching effects. When the team reconvened, they continued the detailed analysis. Each point she had raised was examined rigorously. The conversations were no longer hypothetical. They were concrete discussions about potential impact, ethical responsibility, and long-term consequences. The young woman's input continued to guide the discussion, helping to clarify complex interactions and prevent misunderstandings. By late afternoon, the results of the analysis were clear. The clause, if left unchanged, could indeed create significant challenges in certain scenarios. It was technically correct but practically risky. The CEO listened carefully as the legal team summarized their findings. Her initial concerns had been validated. The room collectively understood that a decision needed to be made, and it needed to be informed by careful reasoning. The CEO finally addressed the room. "We now understand the implications of this clause. We will need to make adjustments to protect all parties involved and ensure fairness. I appreciate everyone's input, especially the observations that brought this to our attention. This process has reminded us that attention to detail and the willingness to speak up are invaluable." There was a quiet murmur of agreement. The atmosphere, once tense and uncertain, was now one of cautious resolution. The young woman felt a sense of accomplishment, but did not allow herself to relax completely. She knew the final steps of revision and approval were still ahead, and continued diligence would be required. The meeting ended for the day, and people began to leave the boardroom. Some exchanged brief conversations about the implications of the clause. Others walked away deep in thought. The young woman remained, gathering her notes and making sure she had documented everything clearly. She knew that her role had shifted from observer to contributor, and that her careful attention to detail had earned the opportunity to influence critical decisions. As she stepped out of the boardroom and into the hallway, she felt a quiet sense of purpose. She had spoken up when it mattered, faced uncertainty with composure, and provided insight that had redirected the conversation. It was a reminder that courage and clarity could have an impact, even in spaces dominated by authority and experience. Outside, the city continued its steady rhythm, unaware of the small but significant changes that had taken place above. Inside the corporate walls, decisions were being re-examined, and respect was being earned through knowledge, honesty, and the willingness to act responsibly. The young woman knew that the moments ahead would require continued focus, but she was ready to engage, contribute, and ensure that fairness and clarity guided the decisions being made. E-table as she began to explain. She did not speak in legal jargon or technical language. She spoke in plain terms that anyone could understand. She described a situation where, in the future, the clause could force one side to carry responsibilities they could not control, limit their options, and even prevent them from addressing problems efficiently. She gave hypothetical examples, small and simple, but enough to make the consequences clear. A few heads nodded slowly. Others furrowed their brows. The CEO leaned forward, elbows on the table, listening intently. She felt the weight of his attention. The moment was delicate. A single misstep could undermine her credibility, but she stayed focused. One of the senior executives, a man who had been quietly observing, cleared his throat. Are you suggesting that this clause could actually cause legal or financial issues? He asked. There was an edge to his voice, a mix of skepticism and genuine curiosity. He did not mock her. He wanted clarification. Yes, she said calmly. It's not illegal, and it may seem standard on paper. But if circumstances change or unexpected challenges arise, the wording could leave one side trapped. They may be limited in responding to those changes or defending themselves in the long term. That's the risk. Another executive whispered something to the lead lawyer, who frowned and began flipping through the documents more carefully. Her explanation had shifted to focus. What had once been a routine review was now a discussion that could alter decisions. The CEO remained quiet for a moment. His hand hovered over his pen, but he did not pick it up. His mind seemed to be racing. He had signed countless agreements before, always with confidence. He had always trusted his team, the language, and the structure. Yet here was a young consultant, someone who had been almost invisible in the room until minutes ago, highlighting a flaw he had not noticed. A tension settled over the table. It was the kind of tension that comes when power meets insight, when experience faces clarity that cannot be ignored. The room was silent, except for the quiet rustle of paper and the occasional click of a pen. I need everyone to reread this, the CEO said finally. His voice was calm but firm. The word reread held weight. It implied that previous assumptions were no longer enough. He motioned toward the lawyers, who began scanning the clause again, slowly, deliberately. She felt a flicker of relief, but did not relax. This was still delicate. People could still dismiss her if they wanted. Some might argue that she was overthinking, that she did not understand the full context. She stayed focused on explaining clearly, letting the simplicity of her reasoning carry weight. She avoided making it personal. This was about the clause, the contract, and the consequences, not about anyone's authority or ego. As the lawyers reread, whispers started among the executives. The senior legal advisor leaned toward the CEO, pointing at specific lines, speaking softly but with intensity. The CEO's brows knitted together. His pen remained on the table. Every so often, he would glance at her, as if seeking confirmation, or perhaps as if measuring how deeply she understood the implications. For the young woman, this was a moment of quiet triumph and quiet fear at the same time. She knew she had to remain composed. Any sign of uncertainty could weaken her position, yet any sign of arrogance could provoke backlash. She focused on her breathing, keeping her words measured and her explanations clear. The CEO finally spoke again, looking at the young consultant. You have studied this carefully? His tone was less questioning now, more serious. There was a hint of respect mingled with surprise. Yes, she replied. I have gone through the language and the context. I've compared it with other agreements we have made. The wording is technically correct, but the potential consequences make it risky. The CEO leaned back, exhaling slowly. He glanced around at his team, then back at her. The room was silent, waiting for someone to speak, for someone to diffuse the tension, for someone to take charge again. But she did not waver. Her calmness seemed to command attention. People were listening genuinely, not just politely. One of the executives finally broke the silence. If what you are saying is true, then this could have long-term implications we need to consider. He sounded cautious, careful not to alienate the CEO, but also not willing to ignore her point. Others nodded, some hesitating, some more assertive. The CEO rubbed his chin. I want the legal team to evaluate the clause thoroughly, not just in isolation, but for potential real-world scenarios, he said. His voice was steady now, but his eyes revealed the gravity of the moment. We will not proceed until we fully understand this risk. For the young woman, that statement was a quiet victory. She had spoken up in a room filled with people far more senior, far more experienced, and they had not dismissed her. Instead, they were taking her seriously. She felt the weight of responsibility, too. This was not about ego or recognition. It was about ensuring the right decisions were made, even if they were uncomfortable. The lead lawyer began to take notes, jotting down points from her explanation. Others scanned their screens and papers, reading and rereading the clause carefully. She noticed subtle nods from some executives who had been skeptical at first. They were processing, considering, evaluating. Her words had sparked a discussion that might prevent serious problems in the future. The CEO finally looked at her again. His smile was gone, replaced by an expression of thoughtfulness. He seemed to be reflecting, weighing the implications, and perhaps reassessing some of his assumptions about risk, oversight, and trust. For the first time in the meeting, he appeared human, not just a powerful figure, but someone who could be influenced by honesty and clarity. She felt a mix of relief and anticipation. Relief because she had spoken up and been heard. Anticipation because she knew the next steps were crucial. This was not the end of the conversation. The contract still needed evaluation, and she would need to continue demonstrating that her analysis was accurate and valuable. As the legal team continued their review, the CEO spoke again, his tone calm but deliberate. "We will pause the signing for now. I want everyone to understand this fully before we make any commitments." The room exhaled collectively. Some executives relaxed slightly, glad for the pause. Others seemed tense, still considering the implications. The young woman remained poised. She had done what she needed to do. Her voice had been heard, and now the real work of analysis and decision-making would follow. She looked around the room. Some people were still skeptical, some quietly impressed. She had shifted the dynamic subtly but profoundly. In a room where power often overshadowed insight, she had managed to make clarity matter. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. Outside the glass windows, the city continued its busy rhythm, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding above. Inside, the young woman sat, hands calmly folded, aware that her courage had made a difference. The CEO, powerful and experienced, had paused. The executives had reconsidered. The contract, once routine, was now being examined with fresh eyes. The meeting was far from over. Challenges remained. The clause still needed thorough analysis. Discussions would continue, and perhaps more questions would arise. But for the moment, a young voice had shifted the conversation, earning attention, respect, and cautious acknowledgement. And she knew, deep down, that speaking up, despite fear and uncertainty, was the only right choice. The contract in front of her was thick. Heavy paper. Clean fonts. Everything looked professional, fair, and balanced at first glance. That was the point. She had reviewed similar contracts many times before, usually late at night, usually without credit. Most of the clauses were standard. She nodded along as the lead lawyer explained them, using confident words and practice phrases. But one page made her pause. She read it again. Slowly, her finger traced a single paragraph near the bottom of the page. It was written in careful language, almost friendly. It promised protection, flexibility, and shared responsibility. Anyone reading quickly would see it as harmless. Even generous, her stomach tightened. She had seen this structure before. Not often, but enough times to recognize the pattern. The wording did not lie, but it bent the truth. It shifted risk in a way that would not show up until years later, when it would be too late to argue. She looked up. The CEO was speaking now, summarizing the benefits of the partnership. His voice was smooth, practiced. Around him, heads nodded. Some people smiled. One executive leaned back, already relaxed. Her heart beat faster. She told herself to stay quiet. This was not her role. She was not senior. She was not invited to speak. She was here to observe, maybe take notes, then leave quietly. But the words on the page would not let her go. She imagined future meetings, future problems, lawsuits, employees losing jobs, communities paying the price for something decided in this room today, all hidden behind polite language and signatures. Her fingers tightened around the paper. The CEO picked up his pen. That was the moment. Her voice surprised even her. "Excuse." She said. It was not loud. It was not aggressive. But it cut through the room like a sudden change in temperature. Every head turned. The CEO stopped mid-motion. His pen hovered above the page. For a brief second, his confident smile remained on his face, frozen, unsure whether it should stay or disappear. "Yes," he said, slowly, looking in her direction. The room waited. She swallowed. Her throat felt dry, but her voice stayed steady. "There's a clause on page 12. The third paragraph. I believe it may cause serious problems later on." A pause. Someone at the table let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. Another executive glanced at the legal team, eyebrows raised. The CEO tilted his head slightly. "Can you explain?" he asked, still calm, still smiling. But something in his eyes had changed. She nodded. "The clause appears to offer shared liability, but in practice, it transfers long-term responsibility to one side while limiting their ability to respond if conditions change." Silence spread across the room. The lead lawyer cleared his throat. "That clause has been reviewed," he said carefully. "It's standard language." She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. "Standard, yes," she said, "but not harmless." The CEO leaned back in his chair now. His smile faded just a little. Not fully. Just enough for those who knew him well to notice. "And you're certain?" he asked. She met his eyes. "I wouldn't speak if I wasn't." That was when the air shifted. This was no longer a routine meeting. This was no longer a junior consultant making a casual comment. This was a challenge. A few people looked uncomfortable. Others looked annoyed. One executive checked his watch, clearly wishing this interruption would end. The young woman felt all of it. The weight of their stares. The unspoken question hanging in the air. Who does she think she is? But she stayed seated. She stayed calm. She explained further, using simple words, careful not to sound dramatic. She pointed out how the clause would work in real life, not just on paper. How it could trap one side into obligations they could not escape. Even if circumstances changed, the CEO listened without interrupting. When she finished, the room was quiet again. The CEO placed his pen down. For the first time that day, he looked unsure. He glanced at the legal team. "Let's take another look," he said. The lead lawyer hesitated, then nodded. Papers shuffled. Screens lit up. The clause was reread, this time more slowly, more carefully. The young woman leaned back slightly, her hands resting in her lap. Her heart was still racing, but she did not regret speaking. Whatever happened next, she knew she had done the right thing. Outside, the city continued moving, unaware that something small but important had just shifted. Inside a quiet room high above the streets, the meeting was no longer about signatures. It was about truth, and this was only the beginning.